All right, good evening. My name is Hunter, and this is week 8 content review for principles biology students. Today we're going over population and community ecology. This is part 2. Okay. Researcher has recently discovered 3 species of parasites that infect developing salamanders. He suspects that one or more of these species cause fatalities during salamander development, and to test his hypothesis, this researcher sets up a series of experiments. In each experiment, he varies the density of the salamander populations. He infects 2% of each test population at the start of the experiment and measures the mortality rate after 4 weeks. To establish a baseline mortality rate, he sets up a control experiment that differs only in that no parasite was introduced at any density. And the data table and graph below relate to the mortality rate of salamanders caused by the 3 different parasites to the original density of the developing salamander population. This is a really fantastic science literacy problem. So looking at this, we already kind of laid out what our variables are, but I will always orient myself to any graphs that we have. We have mortality rate on our y-axis, salamander density on our x-axis. We can see that density remains the same or increases at regular intervals for all of the test subjects, so that's just good experimental design. And then density D and death rate D, this is our control. Okay, so using this information, let's answer some questions. So given the data presented in the graph indicate whether each of the parasite species is acting in a density dependent, or that is, the density of the population affects its mortality, or a density independent fashion, meaning the density does not impact its lethality. So looking at, let's start with A. So we have a solid bar with diamonds, it looks like, and that appears to be this line right here, which is trending upward. Nice. So because mortality is increasing as the population density increases, and this is just 20, 40, whatever individuals per unit area, the actual size doesn't matter for our purposes. But it does look like this one is acting in a density dependent fashion. So parasite A is density dependent because lethality gets more mortality due to parasite A gets progressively higher at each higher salamander density. Let's look at population B. We have our dotted line here. So this one has a really high mortality rate, um, regardless of population density. We have mortality around 80%. So parasite B is density independent. Population density doesn't impact it. However, the mortality rate is um, mortality rate's consistent. However, it's far more fatal than the control or any of the other parasites. High mortality. Parasite C is this one here with the boxes. So a little bit more variability, but it still seems to have basically a flat trend regardless of what the population density is. So this one is density independent. Excuse me. Yeah, density independent. And line D was our control. So no parasites. And this line is important because if we saw a sudden change, a sudden increase in mortality at a certain population density with no parasites present, that tells us that there's some other factor that could be interfering with our data. So we want to make sure that there's nothing else impacting these populations on a density dependent basis um, until we've added those parasites. So this is really good experimental design. You need uh, your negative control. Okay. So after looking at the data for parasites A and B, develop an argument to indicate which is more likely to cause extinction of the salamander population and explain your reasoning. I think we may have touched briefly on carrying capacity just in discussion at the end of last week's worksheet. And when we have something that's density dependent, um, lethality of the parasite goes up as the population density increases. And so as they start to die off, as we lose individuals in that population again, population density decreases, so does lethality. And so population density dependent factors like this do a really good job of maintaining an equilibrium among a population. Um, so this would likely not cause an extinction event because, again, as population decreases, so does the mortality rate. That second parasite, parasite B, is far more likely to cause a extinction level event because it's killing 80% of the population, no matter what the population density is, and it's possible to reduce the numbers so low that the population can't rebound. So parasite B density independent, remaining population can't necessarily rebound or recover. All right. So what models can you use to calculate how quickly population can grow? I'm going to do my best here. There are some issues with my answer key, unfortunately, and that's my problem, not yours, but we'll do the best we can here. So what does each term stand for? Delta N is the change in the number of individuals, change in number of individuals. Delta T, of course, is our time interval. R max is the per capita growth rate, or excuse me, yes, yes, per capita growth rate. And later on in this worksheet, this will be represented by the variable B. And then N is simply our initial population size. So what type of population growth does this equation describe? This describes exponential growth, or this will form a J-shaped curve. So if you have number of individuals versus time, you're going to get something looking like that. So at the beginning of this, it's very important to note that it won't look like there's a lot of change happening, um, even though it is growing at an exponential rate. And what assumptions are made to develop this equation? We are assuming unlimited resources and space or habitat. As long as nothing in the environment runs out, population can grow exponentially uninterrupted. Obviously, we know that's not how things usually go. So we have to put some other parameters in here. So population growth may also be represented by the model delta n over, so the change in the number of individuals, or the change in population over the change in time, equals R max, that per capita um, population growth rate, times the number of initial population size, times the quantity, K, carrying capacity, minus initial population, all over carrying capacity. So what is K? K is carrying capacity. Um, and carrying capacity is the number of individuals that can be sustained over time. K is a function of the environment. It is a function of the environment. Eventually, you're going to run out of space. Eventually, you're going to run out of food. The environment can no longer sustain the number of individuals that are in that space. That is that environment's carrying capacity for that population. If the number of individuals in the population equals K, then what is the change in population per unit time? This would equal 0. That is, there's no change in the population size over time. It will remain at that carrying capacity. Describe in words how delta n over delta t changes from when n is very small to when n is very large relative to k. So looking again at this equation, I'm just going to rewrite it. We've got delta n over delta t equals R max times n times the quantity k minus n all over k. So if n is really small, population is growing exponentially. If n is small, exponential growth. The actual number of new individuals added is relatively small. However, because n is so small, uh, as n nears the value of 1/2 of k, um, delta n over delta t approaches its maximum. And as n approaches k, delta n over delta t decreases. As n increases, the change in population over change in time decreases. What assumptions are made to develop this equation? So this is called the logistic model. The logistic model assumes that resources in space limit growth. Limits the growth of a population in that these factors determine the max number of individuals that can be sustained. And determine max number of individuals that can be sustained over time. Okay, I have rewritten our formula here so that we have it handy. This is where the answer key gets a little funky, and we're going to do our best. And because I don't want to lead you astray on anything, the ones I'm not sure about, we're just going to skip. Uh, so you and your friends have monitored two populations, population A and population B, of wild lupine for one entire growing season. By carefully mapping, tagging, and censusing the plants throughout the period, you obtain the data listed in the chart below. So we have initial number of plants, number of seedlings established, number of initial plants that died. And now we can do some very simple math. I'm going to try and zoom out here again so you can see all this. To calculate the following parameters for each population. The number of births should be pretty easy. This is our number of seedlings established between the two populations. We have 100 and we have 30. We have D, the number of deaths, also pretty easy, 20 and 100. And then we have per capita growth rate. And this again was, we're trying to calculate R max, right? We had the initial population was 500 individuals. We'll do population A first. We don't know what the carrying capacity is. We can do, oh, nope, overthinking it again already. I caught myself last time when I did this wrong. So we have births minus deaths over uh, the initial population. 100 minus 20 is 80, divided by 500 is 0.16. And that is our per capita growth rate. It's the same as R max. We have a negative growth rate for population B, and that is simply 30 minus 100 all over the initial population of 500. Oh, 300. Excuse me. 30 minus 100 all over 300 should be negative 0.233, repeating. Cut ourselves. Same thing there. I'm not sure what D is. It's not labeled. I don't think we need to worry about it. So given the initial population size and assuming the population is experiencing exponential growth at growth rate R, what will the number of plants be in each population in 5 years? Use the initial population size as time 0 and compute to time 5. Um, Someone better at speaking the language of math than I can should be the one to explain this to you. But if you simply take your initial population plus that initial population times your growth rate, that will give you the number of individuals after year 1. And then you take that number and you run that again, right? And you should get, I'm just going to write the answers here and you can do that longhand if you want. If you know the better way to do that, please teach me. You should have 1,050 individuals for population A and 81 individuals for population B. I only know the long, boring, probably dumb way to do this. So using the exponential growth formula, you can determine the amount of time it will take for a population to double in size if you know R max or R. The doubling time is equal to log base 10 times 2 divided by log base time, log base 10, the quantity 1 plus R. Alternatively, this value can be estimated by using the following formula, and I like this one. 70 divided by the percent increase per unit time as a whole number equals doubling time per unit time, or 70 divided by R equals approximate doubling time. Using either of these formulas, the exponential growth formula or the approximate doubling rate formula, calculate the following. So if the population of a country is growing at 2% per year, how many years will it take for the population to double? And that is simply 70 divided by 2% per year equals 35 years. And that is a useful approximation. If your bank account is growing at a rate of 1% per year, how many years will it take for your money to double? The doubling time equals 70 divided by 1% per year equals 70 years. You are studying the growth of a particular strain of bacteria. You begin with a tiny colony on a petri plate. 1 day later, you determine that the colony grew and exactly doubled in size. A calculation showed that if the colony continued to grow at the same constant rate, it would cover the entire plate in 30 days. Assume colony size is directly proportional to the number of individual bacteria. What is the value of R? To answer this, we can just go back to question 4. If you know r, then the doubling time is log base 10 times 2 divided by log base 10, 1 plus r. And this can also be estimated by using that 70 formula. So 70 divided by the percent increase. So that would be, mm, I don't like how they explained this. If it doubled in size, it grew by 100%, right? Does that work? On what day would the bacteria cover half the plate? The bacteria colony doubles in size every day and completely covers the plate on day 30. Then it must cover over half the plate. It must cover half the plate on day 29 um, if it's doubling day over day. It must cover half the plate on day 29 to then double and cover the whole plate on day 30. You collect data on birth and mortality in 3 populations of grasshoppers and calculate the following birth and death rates for these populations. Both populations are experiencing exponential growth. Are the following statements true or false? Population A is growing at the fastest rate. Now let's look. We have, this looks like per population growth rate, and that must be death rate. So we have an overall growth of, the difference is 0.1. B, we have 0.1 and 0.1. So this would be false. I believe they are all growing at the same rate. Population C has the lowest death rate. That is true. That is absolute value, the lowest death rate. Population C is growing at the slowest rate. That is false. These all seem to be growing at the same rate. All populations are growing at the same rate. That is true. In a herd of bison, the number of calves born in 1992, 93, and 94 was 55, 80, and 70, respectively. In which year was the birth rate the greatest? We can't answer this question unless we also know the population size for these each of these years. Okay. A population of pigeons on the west side of town has a per capita annual growth rate of 0.07, so 7% per capita per year. A separate population of pigeons on the east side of town has a per capita annual growth rate of 0.1, 10%. If the populations are both growing exponentially and both are consensus the following year, both are census the following year, in which of the populations will delta n over delta t be the greatest? And again, we can't answer this because we don't know how large the populations were initially. If the two population sizes are equal, or if the population on the east side is larger and the population on the west side, then the delta n over delta t will be greater on the east side, right? So can't say without knowing initial population size. And then we can break that down a little bit further. If the two populations were equal, um, or if the population on the east side is larger, that one of the higher growth rate, per capita growth rate, than the population of the west side, then it's going to be greater on the east side. Um, but if the population on the west side is large and the population on the east side is much smaller, then it could be greater on the west side um, for a long time. So we don't know. A rabbit population has the life table shown here. Okay, fill in the missing data. So number of survivors for years 1 and 2, we have a mortality rate of 0.3, so a third of those. That's a third of 90 is 30. Easy peasy. Number of offspring per reproducing pair, 1.5. So that gives us 60 individuals. That makes sense. Um, number of deaths is 30. Our mortality rate is increasing. 30 is half of 60. Okay. Number of offspring per reproducing pair. Number of survivors. Okay, then here we have a really big mortality rate. That's 80%. We have but six survivors, 6 deaths. That's 100% mortality rate. They're all gone. Owing to a good food supply and a small predator population, the rabbit population is growing by leaps and bounds. The rabbits call a meeting to discuss population control measures. 2 strategies are proposed. Delay all rabbit marriages until age class 2 to 3. Rabbits never breed until after marriage. Or sterilize all rabbits in age class 3 to 4. Which of the proposed strategies will be more effective in slowing population growth? And explain your reasoning and show your calculations. So in the first 2 years of their lives, each reproducing pair of rabbits will have an average of 1.5 offspring. Right? So for a cohort of 100 rabbits born in years 0 through 1, 90 or 45 pairs of rabbits will each have 1.5 offspring during years 1 through 2. So we would be reducing it by that much. They will add about 67.5. So yeah. So we have 90 rabbits or 45 pairs. 45 pairs have 1.5 offspring during that 1 to 2 year. Gives us 67.5 new rabbits. Okay, so that's option A. We would be removing that many. When the same cohort reaches age class 3 to 4, it will consist of 30 rabbits or 15 pairs because of that death rate. Reach 3 to 4. And they'll produce an average of 2.5 offspring. Gives us a total of 37.5. Therefore, the population size will be more limited by delaying rabbit marriages until age class 2 to 3. Logistic population growth in fisheries. Suppose you save or you have a farm on which you grow, harvest, and sell edible freshwater fish. The growth of the fish populations is logistic. You want to manage your harvest to maintain maximum yields, that is the maximum rate of production from your farm over a number of years. And as a fisheries manager, you're responsible for deciding how many walleye can be harvested without destabilizing the population. Walleye are super tasty, whitefish we call them. Below is a data table showing the walleye population in a typical pond on your fish farm over 24 weeks. Draw a graph showing how population size in the pond changes through time. Below is a data table. Draw a graph. Okay, there's our graph. Cool, we've got our graph. How large should you let the population get before you harvest? Identify the point in your graph and explain why this is the best size for your harvest. So the rate of population growth will be fastest at the point on the curve where the slope is the steepest. So this S curve is your logistic growth pattern as opposed to exponential, right? So at this point where the slope is the steepest, our growth is the fastest. This would be about point C on our chart. So we can argue that this would be the best time to harvest. If delta, let's go ahead and write that. Where slope is steepest, fastest growth. Delta n over delta t is the measure of the rate of change. So this is our slope, rise over run. Um, and when you graph n versus t, the slope corresponds to n versus t, n versus time. When that population size is very small, then your carrying capacity minus n over k is very large. And then it's flipped when it starts to increase. Yeah, I think that's all that needs to be explained. The rate of population growth fraction. So population growth, rate of population growth uh, is at maximum when n is equal to half of k. So if our carrying capacity is around 250 walleye, 250 individuals, half of that is when growth is the fastest, and that's going to be our best time to harvest. Assume the carrying capacity for your pond is 250 individuals. Check your answers in part B by using data in the chart and computing the changes in the population size, delta n over delta t, when the population is at several different levels relative to its carrying capacity. Use k equals 250 and r max equals 0.2. I'm not going to run you through the math on this one, but I am going to just rewrite R max times n times the quantity k minus n all over k. You can check the chart above. run the maths. Here are the answers. If you're watching this in the future, just pause and go ahead and do the equation or do your math and then check your work. When n equals k, remember that rate will be 0. Cool. There's more. Is there more? There's more. How are we doing on time? This is a long one, which is part of why we're skipping the the number crunching. All right. A researcher collected data on an experiment she conducted on 2 desert islands. Islands were of similar size, climate, species composition, and richness, and they were the same distance from the mainland. Originally, the same species of snake was present on both islands A and B. In her experiment, the researcher removed the species of snake from island A. For comparison, the species of snake was not removed from island B. She then recorded the number of animal species on each island over a period of 24 months. So we're leaving the snake on one island, we're taking it away on the other, and then we're looking for the relative number of species, so biodiversity on those islands, and whether there's a relationship with the presence or absence of snakes. And here we have the data. Island B, Island A, number of species, time in months. And we see there's an obvious change here. So let's go back again. The snake was not removed from Island B. Island B seems to have remained the same, which is expected. And there's a precipitous decline in the number of species on Island A. Snakes, no snakes. Cool. What can we learn from this? Graph the data, done. Construct a hypothesis that explains the difference between the numbers of species present on Island A versus Island B over the 24-month period. There could be lots of things here, right? The decline was so extreme that we might call the snakes a keystone species. They're so important to the stability of this ecosystem that it collapsed as soon as you removed them. So one reasonable hypothesis would be that the snake is that keystone species. Snake is keystone species on both islands. When it was removed from Island A, another competitor or a predator dominated and drove many other species on the island to extinction. Propose an experimental design to test your hypothesis and explain the reasoning behind your design. So one possible design would be to remove the snake from Island B and then reintroduce the snake species to Island A, and again collect data on species diversity over time. So remove snake from Island B, and we would expect it to have a similar collapse if it is a keystone species on both islands. And reintroduce snake to Island A. You would ideally collect data on not only species diversity, but also population size, species richness. This would allow you to better understand which competitor species is being held in check by the snake. Also collect size and richness data, so the variety of species. What would you expect to find as a result of your experiment? Describe your expected results and draw them on the graph below. So we've got a possible graph here. So with reintroduction, we ideally saw a return of species to Island A and when we took them away from Island B, um, we saw that precipitous decline, indicating that yes, snakes are in fact a keystone species on both islands. That's our review for this week. Um, thank you all for your patience and your attention. Don't forget to turn in your worksheets for extra credit. I will see you all next week.